When I was 19, I ended up living on the streets for some time. Even on the surface, that's a horrific situation, but there's so much more hiding underneath. My name is Michael, and I could go into the string of events that led me to being one of the panhandlers you pass by in the streets. The absentee father, the alcoholic mother, the fights, the foster homes, the halfway homes. But none of it really matters. Shit happens. Sometimes you push through, sometimes it floods over you. The shit, I guess. The fact is, I got to the point where I decided to try out the busy streets downtown. I remember my first day very clearly. The sun was blaring down on me, stinging my freshly bruising black eye. I wandered down the crowded streets as people were running to bars and to the theater. It seemed like a good spot before, but there was so much just barraging my senses. The clacking of each footstep, the voices, the cars and horns. Most distinctly of all, I remember two things. A man laying on a grate, gripping a hat tightly to his head, heaving with uncontrollable sobs, and the screeching of rusty wheels from a cart struggling against the pavement. I never saw the man again. I soon became acquainted with an old man named Elwin. He was a wiry, gray man with a thick beard surrounding a permanent smile. You may know him, since he went viral a while back, when a couple gave him a free ticket to a Blue Jays game. I definitely wouldn't be around if it weren't for him. He taught me who and where to avoid. He shared whatever food he'd received and books he'd gathered. And he was always around, happy just to talk. Elwin seemed to know everyone. The woman by the church? That was Linda, taking care of her disabled older brother. The bigger man outside the Tim Hortons? That's Rick, in massive debt to some shady collectors. The lady on the subway platform? Crystal. Nobody knew anything about Crystal. Something about her filled me with such deep pity. Her bright red hair draped in messy tangles all around her squat body. Her face was always caked in thick makeup, smeared and uneven. I once saw her getting thrown out of a store after using their sample eyeshadow. The cashier was screaming at her in frustration, threatening to call the police if she came in again. Crystal hardly rose her eyes from the ground. She just stumbled down the steps and off to the subway, mumbling incoherently in an attempt to get some spare change. It hurts to think about her. It hurts to think about any of them. I'll just get to the point. I had a nice setup in a tunnel under a bridge. The bridge provided safety from the weather, and the pillars and little walls provided some sense of privacy and, I guess, ownership. Once, a group of kids leapt over the divider between the road and the sidewalk while I was sleeping and landed right on top of me. Scared the hell out of both of us. And sure, the cars driving through were frustrating, and once in a while I heard that goddamn rusty cart wheeling back and forth some way down the way. But this was my home. I then let this one couple stay with me who were just passing through the city. They were desperate and said they'd lend me some pot in exchange. I should have seen the signs, such as all her bruises, or all of his swastika tattoos. But I hit off to a shit day, where I only got $3, not even enough for a decent meal, and came home to a wreck. All my food was gone, same with my knife, and my clothes and sleeping bag were drenched in piss. I was furious. I kept kicking the wall and screaming at people as they drove by. I wanted to find those two and make them pay. I wanted to find anyone and make them pay for where I was. But I sat down and managed to relax. My first thought was to crash with Elwin, but it was already late. I'd sleep somewhere else tonight, and then in the morning I'd clean up this mess somehow. I braced myself and went out into the cold night. By this time it was early September and I was beginning to dread the night. I hadn't slept a night in the snow yet, and the very thought made me shudder. I wasn't heading towards a shining tomorrow. Things were only going to get worse from here. It was going to get colder, harder, and more miserable. Thinking about it filled me with rage. Not the kicking and screaming kind, but the still, dull kind deep in your core. I sat down heavily on a bench. I found myself in a much quieter stretch of road, lined with run-down old industrial buildings and yellow streetlights. I was shocked to realize how far I'd walk from my tunnel in the bustling downtown area. What if this was a dangerous area? In my exhausted state, I didn't care. I lay down and closed my eyes, wrapping my arms around my chest for warmth. I remember waking up to that screeching sound again. The sound floated around in the distance most nights, but never this loud. I could hear metal rattling as the wheels jerked forward sporadically. I covered my ears in the daze, hoping just to ignore it, but it only got louder and louder, until I could feel the figure passing by my face. I slammed my fist on the bench and sat up. "Would you fuck right off? I'm trying to sleep." The hunched over bag lady stopped in her tracks. Her smell, the smell of rancid meat, was the first thing to register with me. I had to stop breathing for a moment. She was a miserable figure. Her black trench coat was like rough, thick tarp, dragging across the muddy ground, picking up sticks and dead leaves. She was bent over at practically a 90-degree angle, leaning heavily on the small cart in front of her, just stacked with an assortment of bottles and cans. I couldn't see her face at all. Not because she was turned away, but because her greasy gray hair hung down in front of her face, curling around her stash of grimy tin and plastic. These are all the characteristics that you sometimes see in the streets, but there was something wrong. I didn't know what it was, but it made my blood run cold. She just stood there, inspecting me without looking, feeling me while still being feet away. Something about this figure paralyzed me, and all I could do was choke out a quiet, "Sorry." The lady twitched in an unusual nodding motion, and she kept walking. I realized my fingers and toes had gone numb. I wasn't sure if that was because of the cold. As the bag lady turned the corner into the small alleyway, I heard a quiet moan. Out of curiosity, or maybe just the strange notion that I was dreaming, I stood up. As quietly as possible, I began to make my way to the dark path. Another moan, more alert, a spike of panic. I moved faster and turned the corner. Crystal was stumbling to her feet while gripping the wall. She had a torn mattress slumped in the corner. The bag lady leaned on her cart, pushing it towards Crystal. Compounded with a crunch of glass and dirt, the shrieking of the wheels was physically nauseating. Crystal kicked at the cart. It was just a sick old lady. Why was Crystal panicking? Why was I? Crystal kicked the cart again, knocking it over with a crash. I tried to cry out for them to stop, but my voice got caught in my throat. The bag lady advanced, unaffected. This frail, old figure, still at the right angle. She was leaning on nothing. She only moved faster. Crystal mumbled in a panic, feebly slapping at the woman. The woman charged at her stomach, head first, pinning her against the wall. Crystal didn't scream. I don't think she could anymore. Her eyes widened in terror and pain as she gripped the woman's back. She whimpered frantically. I wish I had done something. Then I heard the crunching and slurping. Then I saw the blood pooling on the ground around Crystal's flip-flops. Crystal knocked the greasy gray away from the thing's head. I couldn't see its face, if it had one. It was buried too deep in Crystal's abdomen, twitching and lurching deeper and deeper. It was when it arced up into Crystal's chest, and her ribcage expanded and began to burst with multiple grotesque snaps that I threw up in my hands and down my shirt. This brought me back, and I finally ran. I ran and screamed and cried, covered in sweat and vomit. The rest of the night is a blur. I somehow made it back to my tunnel, surely horrifying many people along the way with my ravings and appearance. I just know I woke up the next day in my piss-covered sleeping bag. It took 4 months of hard work at random jobs and social assistance, but I'm no longer on the street. In that time, more have disappeared. All I know is that there were many days and nights where I'd hear the screech of those rusty wheels somewhere in the crowd. I still hear it. I've only ever told Elwin about that night. His eternal smile fell away, but he wasn't shocked. He just nodded slowly and said a prayer for Crystal. I asked how nobody has noticed that this thing is out there. He told me, as far as anyone is concerned, Crystal has been dead a long, long time. I still visit Elwyn quite a bit. I feel like it may be a way to keep him safe, so I guess that's all I'm asking you to do. Please, just notice that these people exist. I've seen what can happen when they don't.